on here, and so when they start to stream it, which will probably be at 1 o'clock if you're all ready, then we can just push a button, is my understanding, and it'll start happening. So I think we got about 3 minutes.
Okay.
Unless you want to do something different. Oh,
it does say.
well, now it's maybe we started.
It's okay, just so
Maybe
people
we
know that
started.
we're live.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll wait a couple minutes before we start.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Connie.
Hello, good afternoon.
And are all the handouts available on the website, on the OLA website?
Yes, they are linked on our website, and they should be linked on the legislative calendar as well. And then you all should have received them by email yesterday.
And when discussing those, will you put them up on the screen for?
We do have the ability to do that, yeah, by screen share. Yes.
I know sometimes that's a challenge.
Yeah, we're, as long as everybody is a little patient with us and shows us some kindness, then I think we'll do the best we can with that.
Patience, kindness. Is this the Legislative Audit Commission?
I can hope. No, yeah.
And we will start right away. Good afternoon. This meeting of the Legislative Audit Commission shall come to order. Members and members of the public, this meeting is being conducted pursuant to rules adopted by the House and the Senate for virtual meetings. We will be trying to conduct the business as best we can throughout this meeting. Members, I would ask if you use the raise your hand feature to be called on. And I would ask if the presenters could speak first, and then we will try to take questions after. It'll make it go a little bit easier. We have a lot of material to go through today. We want to make sure that we have a full discussion and that we're able to navigate the technology for full participation. So with that, Ms. Randall or Mr. Nobles, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Legislative Audit Commission. We appreciate this meeting as an opportunity to give you a status report on how we're doing in the Office of the Legislative Auditor. I would say we're adjusting, as everyone is, to the virtual world, and almost all of the staff at OLA are working remotely, and we communicate through sort of the same means we're communicating today with the rest of you, and also with agencies, because we have to have ongoing communication in our audit work with agencies, and so it's all done virtually. We did send out a packet of material. I want to just quickly identify those documents. I think we'll probably be really coming back to some of them and not necessarily getting into an in-depth discussion as we go through each one. The first one just gives people an overview of how the Office of the Legislative Auditor is organized. And it's a pretty simple organization, and it's in part structured by statute. And we have a financial audit division and a program evaluation division, and then we also have support staff. In addition to that, in recent years, we've added a director of our special reviews, which come in response to legislative requests or issues that arise from citizens contacting us and Mr. Alter is going to talk a bit about that in a minute. So that's the organization chart. And then we have just a very high-level summary of our staffing, which has been relatively constant over recent years. And then the next document is our appropriation. And again, it's relatively constant, although some growth. And one of the recent additions that you will see is that in addition to general funding, we have also been receiving some dedicated funding with a dedicated purpose. The next document is simply an update, which I try to provide periodically to legislators, and it just shows you all of the different projects that are in process. And I think what it shows you is that we have a full slate of work. We have started our work on auditing the state's financial statements. We've also started work on what we call the single audit, which is a legal requirement from the federal government that the state has to have an independent audit of the state's use of federal funds. And we're going to come back to the single audit as a major issue in the financial audit division. I won't go through each one, but you will just see there the different financial audits that we have in process. Because of several different circumstances, we have had to delay some audits, and we've had to cancel some audits. And again, that was largely to do because of the requirements that the federal government added to the single audit that we have to conduct this year. And so again, we'll come back to that issue of the single audit in terms of our responsibilities and our resources. The next document is just a very high-level summary of how we spend our money. And you'll see that most of the money goes to salaries. And the next largest amount goes to a lease. And some legislative offices may be surprised by that because they do not necessarily pay for the space that they lease or rent. But we're in the Centennial Building, and so we do have a lease, and that is a significant amount of our expense. And then we have a significant IT support for our work, and a very necessary part of our work, and so that also is some of our expenditures. The next document comes back in much more detail to this issue of the single audit and what we are trying to do and have tried to do over the years to really focus our financial audit work on work that will be of relevance and significance and importance to the legislature. And we have some real concerns about the single audit, not only because of the amount of resource it takes, but because of the result in the reports that we have found are not really addressing some legislative issues. So again, we will come back to that. We will also come to a discussion about budget options. And we have been asked to set forth options for the coming fiscal year. We know the state is going to face, you're going to face some very tough decisions about funding. And we're highly aware of that. But like everyone else, you know, we're also very aware of the fact that we are always seeming to be somewhat understaffed for the work that we have to do. So we've laid forth a number of options, recognizing both realities, the reality of the state not having the money that it previously had because of COVID-19, but also the reality that given our jurisdiction and responsibility, we cannot, always do the work that we would like to do and that sometimes you expect us to do. And then the final document, I believe in the packet, is the performance review policy that the Legislative Audit Commission has considered in the past. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be coming back to discuss some of these issues in depth, but I think, as you said, we've got a lot to cover. So I'd like to move on and have Ms. Randall give the commission and the public who may be watching an overview of our work in the Program Evaluation Division.
Mr. Nobles, Senator Rest does have a question for you. So Senator
Okay.
Rest.
Yes.
Senator Rest.
Senator Rest, you're
My
muted.
question is about the budget for the office, so I'll ask that later. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Nobles. Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Judy Randall. I'm the Deputy Legislative Auditor for OLA's Program Evaluation Division. It's nice to see you all and to have you on this call today. I hope you're all doing well. I'm just going to be real quick and do a quick run through of the 5 program evaluations you all authorized our office to do in the spring. Just as a reminder, we are doing evaluations of the Board of Cosmetology, Child Protection Removals and Reunifications, CUGMEC, which stands for the Collaborative Urban and Greater Minnesota Educators of Color Program, driver examination stations, and then MnDOT's contracting and workforce goals. Our project teams are eyeball deep in doing surveys and crunching data and doing interviews and doing all the file reviews, doing all the research that we do every year. I will just quickly say that COVID, of course, has affected how we're doing our work. Everybody's working, from home. And we're using GoToMeeting, and we're doing phone calls, and we're doing everything we can to keep moving forward as productively as possible. I think things are taking a little bit longer, most notably when we're reaching out to agency staff, whereas before we could call and they would answer the phone. Now everything takes, kind of 5 emails to set up a convenient time to talk, and sometimes that's later in the afternoon, and sometimes that's 2 weeks from now. And so teams are being as nimble as possible, and of course we're trying to be as understanding as possible while still moving forward with our work. And I'd say we work well with agencies, and they understand our role, and so everyone's kind of doing the best they can. But I can't give you any updates yet. We're still plugging away on actual research, and so we haven't even finalized any findings or anything. But we anticipate having those 5 reports available to release to you all during session of 21. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll pass it to Mr. Alter, who can talk about the special reviews. Thank you.
Before you do that, are there any members who have any questions? Seeing no hands, thank you, Ms. Randall. Mr. Alter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Joel Alter. I'm the Director of Special Reviews for OLA. And before I get in and describe and talk about the special reviews that are currently underway, just a reminder that on an ongoing basis, we receive allegations, complaints. We have an online form, but we get those things through other means. And so there's a team of us internally that every 2 weeks takes a look at what's come through the door. And we decide as a group what merits further investigation. And in a very limited number of cases, we decide that something deserves to be a special review by the office. And I should add that in addition to complaints and allegations, we also regularly receive reports from agencies of data breaches or disclosure of not public data. We also receive reports from agencies of attempted fraud, of theft, of loss of state funds or property. Those are all things that we log in. We talk about again every 2 weeks. So far in this calendar year, we've considered over 200 of those items. So there's kind of an ongoing churn of things that come through the door. I wanted to also just remind you briefly of 2 special reviews that we've issued in the last few months. One came out right at the end of the legislative session. It was a review of school trust land management and oversight that came out in May. And this was a legislative request. We took a look at both the executive and legislative arrangements for overseeing school trust lands and had recommendations for both branches. And so that's a report just to be aware of. And then in June, we had a report called State Regulation of For-Hire Passenger Transportation. So MnDOT regulates things like limousine services, transportation for people with disabilities, party buses, coach buses, tour buses. And we had heard some concerns that raised issues about whether MnDOT was fully complying with what it has to do to oversee those things. So we took a look at that. We did find problems, and we offered recommendations for both MnDOT and the legislature. In terms of what we're currently working on, I'll talk about this one briefly. Mark Matheson, I think, will be on shortly. He's our lead IT auditor. But one of the things that is a special review right now, if you recall back in February when we had the presidential primary, there was a problem. It only lasted for, I think, 17 minutes, but it nonetheless was a problem with the website for people who were looking for their polling place at the state or the Secretary of State office. And they got redirected to basically a partisan website to get that information. And so we've asked our IT auditors, there are two of them, to essentially look under the hood, because they're good at that, and to see what happened. Have those issues been corrected? And so they're writing that report right now. We also, as promised, are taking a look at the Pollution Control Agency's oversight and regulation of the Water Gremlin Company. You may recall that in 2019, MPCA issued a very large penalty to this company. They did that because of alleged longstanding multiple violations of the company's air quality permit. And so our review is focused not on the culpability of the company, but rather what we're focused on is whether there's anything that MPCA could have or should have done to allow them to prevent or detect or intervene in this issue before they did. And so we are well along with the research on that. If we don't issue it by the end of 2020, it will be out in early 2021. We are also currently doing a law enforcement compensation analysis. And this is something that was mandated by the 2020 legislature. We were asked to do a study comparing the salaries and benefits of state troopers with more than 30 law enforcement agencies in the Twin Cities metro area. And the initial report is supposed to be done in January of 2021. I should add that there is actually provisions in statute for that to be a regular report that our office issues. That may be a topic that our office wants to come back and talk with you about. I'm not sure it's the ideal thing for OLA to be doing, but we're going to issue this report in January. It'll be a thorough, good report, but it takes a substantial effort, but we'll get there. And then the last thing I want to mention is we received a request in 2019 to do a special review of the Polymet mine case, and specifically the MPCA's issuance of a water quality permit to Polymet. Almost at that same time, just after we got that request, the Minnesota Court of Appeals assigned to a Ramsey County District Court judge the job of doing more exploration of that very issue and looking at allegations of irregularities in the MPCA's permit process. And so that judge has taken this very seriously, spent more than a year, and during the course of that, took testimony, issued subpoenas, reviewed many documents, and just earlier this month issued, I guess it's called a ruling, but essentially what it is advice to the Court of Appeals. So this issue was in the Court of Appeals' hands before. It will continue to be in the Court of Appeals as they consider that water quality permit. Our general practice is if an issue is in litigation, we don't get involved in it. What we have been doing, though, is we've monitored what the court has been doing, or the courts. And as questions have come up from legislators and others, we've tried to help them understand where this is all at, because it is complicated. Elizabeth Stawicki just put together a memo earlier this month summarizing the court's recent findings on this case. So good to be aware of that. I think that's where we're at with special reviews, and I'll turn it over to whoever's next. Thank you.
Members, are there any questions for Mr. Alter? Thank you. Seeing
So
none.
we will now turn to Mark Matheson, who is the director of our IT audits. And Mark, I don't see you, but I think you're there. So
I am here.
all right, let's hear from you.
Mr. Chair, members, as Mr. Nichols, I am Mark Matheson, the Information Technology Audit Director of the Office of the List of Auditors. And briefly, a little recap on what our team of, as Mr. Alter, IT auditor, our main focus over the last year is really focused in on.
We can't understand him, or I can't.
No, Mr. Matheson, you have a
Audio is not so good.
copy.
The audio's is.
I believe so. Could you proceed again, Mr. Matheson?
I'm going to shut off the video and see if that helps.
And you know what, if everyone else could mute your lines, that would be helpful as well.
Yep.
We'll try again. Mr. Chair, Commission members, for the record, my name is Mark Matheson, the Information Technology Audit Director with the Office of the Legislative Auditors. As Mr. Alter mentioned, our team consists of myself and one other IT audit specialist, and our focus of audit work has over the last year has primarily focused on the legislative requirements for us to do some work on the Minnesota vehicle title and registration system. So there's current law that requires us to produce quarterly reports on the status of that project. So we did issue in 2020 a report in March, June, and most recently on September 10th, we issued the third quarterly report. We do have a quarterly report coming due again in December. Again, this is kind of a critical point for that project, as it primarily there's a large implementation scheduled for November 16th on that. With that said, we also tried to fit in other IT audit work between the review of the projects. So as Mr. Alter mentioned, we're currently working on the special review with the Secretary of State, taking a look at rolling back some of the technology and seeing exactly what potentially happened there. And that report is scheduled to come out within the next month here. With that said, we've also been trying to work on a disaster recovery strategies of critical IT systems report. So this was something we started earlier this year, actually earlier last year, and due to staffing limitations and the vitreous work and ongoing single audit work that we perform, we've put that on hold until anticipated into 2021 to release that with some updated field work. And as Mr. Nobles had mentioned, as far as looking at as our office conducts single audit reviews, many single audit requirements require that in addition to looking at the program, we look at the internal controls of the IT systems. So while we often rely on some of the financial audit divisions, there are cases whereby the definitely could be utilize a specialist to look at some of the controls under the hood. And with a variety of programs, we become pretty strapped on our resources to do that. But we're beginning to do that now, and that work will take us through the winter. And with that, I guess I'd be open to any questions or moving on to into the agenda.
Members, are there any questions for Mr. Matheson? Seeing none, Mr. Nobles.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, to refer you back to the organization chart, and now we're going to talk about the financial audit division. And I think the first thing to notice, and I'm sure you remember this, that we currently do not have a deputy in that position. Chris Boozy left some months ago, and we have that position posted. I hope to fill it soon, but over the last several months, I have relied on the audit directors that you will see in the organization chart, who have responsibilities for different aspects of our audit work. And I've also tried, probably without fully succeeding, to provide them with the leadership in the absence of Mr. Boozy. But I think it is vitally important that the division soon get a permanent deputy and also have a support staff person. That person who is there, known on the chart there as a confidential secretary, which is provided for in the law, also retired. So there is some real significant vacancies in the financial audit division. You'll see that there's also an audit coordinator and other vacancies in that division. So then I guess I would refer you back to my update, which just shows, I think, the volume of work that the Financial Audit Division does. And so there's a lot going on. The one at the top of the list is actually required by Minnesota law, that we every year have to audit the state's financial statements. It's absolutely essential that the state receive an independent audit of its financial statements. Bond rating houses, credit rating agencies require that, and we have been doing that for many years, and it takes a significant amount of our resources. But I would also just remind you that in addition, the legislative auditor in all of our work has jurisdiction that is just quite enormous, is the best word I can use. We have jurisdiction to audit every organization in the executive branch, from the governor's office to the Board of Cosmetology, everything in the executive branch. We also have jurisdiction to audit within the judicial branch, and we do audit district courts from time to time and various other offices. We have jurisdiction to audit at the University of Minnesota, MNSCU, or Minnesota State it is now called, and many other organizations, boards, commissions. I think that if you counted them up, there are probably over 130, 40 different organizational units within state government that we have responsibility for. And then we have responsibility of metropolitan agencies. The point I'm making is that we have to have a strategic approach. And so over the years, I have tried to focus our resources more and more on the core of state government. And not only the core of state government, but audits that we think will be of greater use to the legislature in its oversight functions. So we have pretty much abandoned doing financial statements for individual agencies other than the entire state. So we do not do financial statement audits at the University of Minnesota State, Housing Finance Agency, State Fair. We used to do that work, but that is work that I think can adequately, competently be done by a CPA firm. So we really try to focus on going in depth in organizations, the boards, commissions, the agencies, the programs that you care, I think, the most about. So that has been our strategy over many years. What is the big obstacle we face right now? Well, you heard it from a number of the previous speakers, and that is, it's something called the single audit. And that's it's called a single audit because that's what it's called just in the audit community. And it is a federal requirement that organizations, not only the state, but local units of government and even nonprofit organizations that receive significant amounts of federal money must have an independent audit of the use of those funds. Years ago, when the single audit was first enacted by the Congress, the Office of the Legislative Auditor took on that responsibility. That responsibility has grown significantly over the years. It has become more and more complex to do that work. And again, I don't think it necessarily produces the kinds of audit reports that are of great interest to the legislature. And I have one of our audit directors ready to elaborate on that. So we would like to propose to have the Commissioner of Management and Budget take over that responsibility. There's nothing in the law that says OLA has to do that audit. Many states hire it out to CPA firms. So there's no federal requirement that it be done by OLA or a state audit organization at all. And there are many firms out there that do single audit work. And that would save us a significant amount of time and resources that we could then dedicate to more of the kinds of audits that I think legislators are interested in. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm prepared to answer any questions, and I have several of our audit directors available to talk about what we're dealing with in our financial audit division, because that really is the place where we are the most stretched and the most feeling the stress. So with that, Mr. Chairman, be happy to take questions.
Nobles, we have several questions. So Senator Rest, then Representative Liebling, then Senator Kane. So Senator Rest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have some questions about a number of things that you mentioned, but with regard to the single audit, if that responsibility was moved to MMB, although it would, I note the cost that you indicate in your memo, but would they expect a budget adjustment to MMB in order to pay for it? So it would not be monies that would be then freed up for the OLA. It would be monies transferred to MMB to undertake this responsibility. Are you anticipating that? Are you anticipating if they I don't know what it takes for them to accept that. Maybe it's a directive from the governor, or how would that happen if it went to MMB, and how would it be funded, and would it, all things being equal, would it affect the OLA's budget, and if so, how? That's my first question, Mr. Chairman, and then I have a follow-up.
Mr. Nobles.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Rest, thank you very much for that question, because I think it is a central issue. And I'm going to try to make this as clear as I can. The money, when the federal government gives money to the state in the form of grants, they include a portion in that grant for various kinds of overhead and administrative costs. And one of those costs that they say they're willing to pay for is an audit of those federal programs under the single audit. So that money sits out there in agencies, but it never has come to OLA. That money is not kind of collected from the agencies in their grants and then appropriated to OLA. The idea is that you appropriate the money from the general fund and other funds to support the work of OLA. And then this federal money, which is used for a variety of purposes, support the various administrative functions, the accounting system and the audit work, it just sits there in a pool. So my proposal is that legislation be enacted that directs the commissioner of MMB to do the work and collect that money under the commissioner's authority to pay for that audit work. For OLA to do it, it costs us about $1,200,000 a year. So it's, about a third of our financial audit budget. Now, that number that I just gave you is based on an average salary at OLA of about $50. So, hiring it out to a CPA firm may cost more. But again, to go to your central question, the money is in the executive branch. And I talked to Mr. Showalter today. I've talked to previous commissioners about this issue. They do believe that they would need authority to obtain that money from the agencies, that they do not have existing authority to unilaterally say to the Department of Transportation, the Department of Health, we're going to take X amount of money from the federal grant that you received.
A follow-up, Mr. Chairman?
Senator Rest.
So if that pool of money is there, I doubt that it's not being used for some purpose, and certainly the agencies where they are cooperating in providing the data and so forth for the OLA to conduct the single audit, they are making use of those funds. So it's not like it's in a sinking fund that just sits there and earns interest or something. It's being used, but it's being used by the agencies in helping them prepare for the work done by the by the OLA. Is that a correct observation,
Mr. Noble.
Mr. Chairman? Thank
Mr.
you.
Chair, Senator Rest, yes, I think that is a correct observation. I don't think that money is sitting just collecting interest. I think it's being used for a variety of overhead and administrative expenses. And this is why, in order to accomplish this, I think we really have to work with the executive branch. We have to work specifically with the Commissioner of MMB, Mr. Commissioner Chowalder, and when he was previously here, he and I have had conversations about this. I had extensive conversations with the most recent commissioner, and I think they see the point that this is a state responsibility, but not necessarily a responsibility that OLA has to fulfill. So I think we need to open a discussion and have a negotiation in a way with the executive branch and the legislative branch over this issue. And then you as the legislature can decide whether you want to keep our appropriation constant. And if you do, what we would do, as I've said before, is try to do more control compliance work in the various agencies, departments, boards, commissions that are of concern to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a more general question about the financial audits, but I will hold off on that in case anybody wants to continue asking questions or making comments about the single audit.
Thank you. Representative Liebling.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Nobles. I had very similar direction of questions to Senator Rest, so some of this has really been addressed. But just to continue that conversation, just so I understand, when these grants come to the agencies, is the portion of the funding designated for the administrative piece, is that just a pot that would be labeled administrative? It isn't something where the amount for an audit specifically would be set aside, so that I'm just wondering if, if we go back and look, I mean, I don't remember ever seeing in an agency's budget, here's a portion of the federal funding that we got for administrative, or certainly not for an audit. And I'm just wondering if we would find that, if it would be differentiated, how much was supposed to be for auditing purposes.
Mr. Chairman, and yes, Representative Liebling, this really, it's a very important question. And again, I think this is something we're going to have to dig deep with MMB and the agencies to answer some of those questions. But from my knowledge, no, there is not a specific amount that is designated for audit work. I think there are certainly provisions in the grants about allowable use of the money, and an audit is included as an allowable use. But and how much that would need to be will vary a great deal, from department to department. The size of the departments are significantly different. And not to diminish that, $1 million or $2 million is a large amount of money. We're talking about an overall state budget and the budgets in some individual agencies that are billions of dollars. So this amount of money that would be taken if this proposal becomes law would not, for most agencies, be a significant percentage of their budget. So you're right, Representative Liebling. I think we need to do some work with the agencies, with MMB, on really sorting out how much is there for audit work. My understanding of what happens is that there is this pool of money that is available to pay these various costs. And so MMB every year does something called the indirect cost allocation. And so they go into agencies not only to get their federal money, but they say, okay, DNR, you need to pay a share of your money to cover some of the costs of general administration of state government, like the accounting system, the personnel system. And so that allocation is done by MMB. I think there are maybe 3 or 4 people, and I don't necessarily count myself among them, who really understand the details of how that indirect cost allocation system works. But we can find out. And I think we will need to answer some of your questions.
Well, thank you for that, Mr.
Representative-
Nobles. And I, just to wrap up, just to say, I understand the concern and that I understand the request, and I don't think it's an unreasonable request. But it just strikes me that actually actually moving to where you want to go could be extremely challenging, especially right now,
Yes.
given our financial situation, and that we should really look. I think we're going to, as a commission, going to need to really dig into the budget and see, where we can economize with the LAC. And one of the things that I continue to be concerned about, and I bring this up all the time during the legislative session, is where legislators want to allocate new jobs to the LAC that don't go through the commission. And it happens all the time. You mentioned a few of those things in your rundown of things that you're being required to do by statute. And somehow, as a legislature, we need to be really clear with ourselves about how work gets assigned to the LAC, to the auditor. So
I think that is a very important thing to continue having that conversation.
Thank you. Representative Quam, and then Senator Kiffmeyer, Senator Cran, and then Senator Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Because these are federal funds coming and states vary on how they handle the auditing function, I think that is why there isn't a precise, clear definition there that allows flexibility between internal and some part of the government doing the audit and external agencies, as which we've are familiar with. So I'm not surprised or shocked that there isn't a delineation percentage, but I fully understand there is a defined requirement. And the state of Minnesota has had a few instances where the federal government hasn't liked the way we've done things, and they've come in and done their own review. I remember there was a HMO issue, about 6-8 years ago, of where they clawed back funds because we did not adequately follow the guidelines that the federal government expected us to. I think there were other things that we've seen recently with similar. So the protection of having an adequate audit function and oversight is key. I think it makes it easier for us to get grants and decreases the costs that we have when the federal government says we're going to audit you and check it out. So I see the requirement and abiding by the requirement as a key function that we need to support. I don't think we can define the, it's X percent. However, I do think that saying, well, it's just overhead internal to the agency is not correct, because external auditing, whether it's another part of the government or a non-governmental entity, is required. It's just like having somebody read something and proof it. Your mind understands what you're trying to say and do, but someone else looks at it and they see things that you overlook. So I wholeheartedly support the idea that when we're looking at adequately covering the function, a required function, that we do look at some of these funds that come in from the grants. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Quam. Mr. Chairman, if I could just elaborate just a little bit, because I think this will really illustrate the situation quite clearly. One of the things that really tipped us to feel some urgency about this single audit issue happened this year with the money that the state is receiving under the CARES Act, under the pandemic relief legislation and appropriations. As is true with all grants that come from the federal government said, yep, you got to audit that. And they have some money set aside for those kinds of functions. But again, that money doesn't come to us. And we have no authority or ability to charge the federal agency for our work. That money resides at MMB and in the governor's office for distribution. So I have written to Commissioner Showalter and met with him today to ask that this year we are so stretched in dealing with the single audit and these new COVID monies and audit requirements, and they're coming at us very late. We are going to try to work out an arrangement with MMB that they will take over just the COVID piece, the CARES Act piece this year, and find an outside audit firm or somebody who is an independent auditor to do just that piece. We will do the rest of the single audit. But frankly, just adding that element of the COVID money, the CARES Act money, and the complexity of it, the fact that the federal government has been quite late in telling us about our responsibilities and establishing what the testing requirements would be, it just sort of pushed us over the edge. One final thing you have to understand, and that is we have a deadline we have to meet. So just like with our audit of the state's financial statements, the federal government imposes a deadline, and we had anticipated that, and I would still hope that they would reconsider this, because of the added responsibilities of auditing the CARES Act money, that they would extend that deadline. But just so you know, that's been one of the problems in doing single audit, is that we go over to an agency and we start looking at the things the federal government wants us to look at. And if we start seeing problems beyond what the federal government has asked us to do, we sort of say, well, we can't linger here. We can't go any deeper into this issue because we have to meet a deadline. Now, several years ago, I had a whistleblower come to me and say, from within a department, who said, you know, your auditors have been here for a long time auditing these programs under the Single Audit Act. But I want to tell you, Mr. Nobles, they missed a bunch of stuff. There are problems in this agency. Happened to be at DHS. The issue happened to be eligibility determinations. And so he gave us information that really showed there was a serious problem. So I went to the audit team who had done the single audit work, and I said, we have this report that you missed some stuff. And they're like, well, we fulfill the federal requirements. Yeah, we know there are problems, but we couldn't expand our scope to spend time there. So that was several years ago. And I said, well, we're going to go back. We're going to go back and look at greater depth outside the single audit at eligibility determination for human service programs. And that's what originally got us into uncovering a lot of the issues related to eligibility determination. It was not the single audit. I mean, again, we, under the single audit, we're over at DHS more than any other agency. But we are doing things that are of interest to the federal government. Let me give you one example. In fact, Lori, are you out there? You can express it much better than I. If I could call on Lori Lyson, Mr. Chair, one of our audit directors, has I think just a key example of this issue of why the federal government requirements don't always yield something that is of great interest to the legislature. Lori, are you there?
Lyson?
Mr. Chair, members, I'm Lori Lyson. I'm one of the Financial Audit Division directors. One of the examples, well, first, I just want to say that we're not trying to dismiss the importance of the need for oversight of these federal programs. It's more about us being able to express our concern about the value that we're bringing to the state of Minnesota and the legislature with these audits. And so one of the things that the federal government provides to us is there's a number of programs each and every year that receive federal funds, and we have to determine which federal programs to audit. So on average, we're auditing, 16, 18 programs a year. And for each program, there is approximately 6 requirements that are set by the federal government that we need to audit. And they even tell us the particular way in which we, the things that we need to look at and how we need to look at those requirements. So one of the requirements is called cash management. And most of the federal programs are on a reimbursement basis. So as they are expending money, they draw down those funds from the federal government. So we are required to take a look at that and ensure that the federal programs or the state programs aren't drawing down before those expenditures have occurred. So our testing is to take a look at that. The first thing I want to say about that is every federal program that we audit, I have never seen a program that hasn't expended all funds awarded. If we eliminate those that are entitlement programs, which would continue to receive funding, we're talking about all the other programs that receive a federal award. They're always expending those funds. So we're taking a look at that and determining and ensuring that there's no expenditures that are being requested before they've incurred. On top of that, then we need to, if there is any funds that are requested prior to them being expended, we then need to determine what that interest would be for the federal government. So an example of that was last year, we had a program at DEED, the Vocational Rehabilitation Program, and we needed to calculate the interest, and it ended up being $26. So we're performing audit work looking at cash draws coming down from the federal government and calculating interest that amounts to only $26. So that's one of the examples I can give. I can talk more if any of the members are interested in hearing that.
Thank you, Lori. Yes. So, Mr. Chairman, let's go back to the members. I think we've taken up enough time here.
Representative Quam, was your question answered?
Yes, I wanted the topic touched upon. Thank you.
Senator Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. So when I take a look at this situation with a single audit, I think of it as it's an executive branch responsibility, and the executive branch got the money to do it. And so instead of our branch, a legislative branch, who didn't get the money, but nicely is doing all this work gratis for the executive branch, I think we need to put this back where it belongs. So we have private sectors all the time, corporations, businesses who hire out auditing. It doesn't mean they're not independent. They do that. Or it's also county, city, other kinds of local governments who do this. But the main thing is it should be returned to the executive branch that has the duty and the responsibility to do this auditing. And the legislature should preserve the legislative auditor for the kinds of functions that the legislative branch is responsible to do. So on principle, I think that's what's really important. As to working out, now that for whatever reason, they took it back when they had maybe resources or time, and now want to move it back over, Mr. Nobles is going to have to work with Mr. Showalter and us in the legislature. But I think on principle, this would be really a good thing to put this back in the executive branch where it belongs and where they actually have the money in those audit accounts. Most of the time, like when we in the legislature, when we fund a grant program, we give administrative expense money, either a percent or a dollar amount, in order to cover those kinds of things, which would include that. That's their responsibility then to use that money for it. Since the federal government gave it to the executive branch, then they should retain that responsibility and get that back to do it.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just interject one other point here. Actually, Senator Cran introduced a bill to do exactly that. because of other events that occurred. There really wasn't time for consideration. But I just want to acknowledge that Senator Cran did that, and he probably wants to speak to that, but Senate File 3929 does exactly what we're talking about. And in fact, it has the provision, and I will quote, that the Commissioner of MMB is responsible, and the cost of the audit shall be considered a statewide indirect cost as defined by 16A 127. And the Commissioner shall use the federal funds obtained pursuant to that section to cover those costs. So there's provision in law that recognizes the Commissioner's authority to obtain this money under the indirect cost allocation system.
Agree.
Senator Kiffmeyer, anything else?
Nope, that's it. And thank you, Mr. Nobles, for your comments, because I think that helps shine light on it. I'm aware of Senator Cran's bill, and I think that exemplifies what I've been talking about as well. I would hope that we, in a bipartisan way, could join together in regards to this and support it in the end. Once, I don't know if it's even, I think the indirect expense legislation that's already there already empowers MMB to cover the costs of doing the single audit.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, Senator Cran's bill was bipartisan. Senator Bach and Senator Hoffman were also authors.
Thank you.
Good lead in to Senator Cran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and Mr. Nobles did state, that we had the bill, we had a hearing on it, and I think we had great conversation. I think our conversation today has focused on what are those things that we can, and I think we should be looking at every facet of our government operations. Where do we get the highest value activities from our most skilled personnel that we have? In my conversations and working through that bill, everybody I spoke to in the OLA's office who performs the single audit doesn't believe they're adding much value. When we look at all of the things that are before us every day, and the surveys or the other process audits that we would like to get taken care of, and to put the skilled people on more process flow or real in-depth programmatic overviews, this is what I think it should be one of our highest priorities from the OLA Commission, that we continue to pursue and get our highest value talent on the most critical things that we need as a legislature. And so I would hope that we have continued support and that we move it forward, one with this commission, and then find the legislative support so we can make it happen. Because when we talk about, Senator Benson's going to have a few challenges in the Department of Health and Human Services. The challenges that we've had there and trying to get eyes on there. We have a team that's already in DHS that could really get down to those, to the process audits of not only are the dollars that we're spending valuable, but what are the outcomes from the entire life cycle of those transactions that affect people's life, the quality of lives and literally their life in what we do. So I would like to see those redirected, and we would like everybody's support. Mr. Chair, I do have one other quick, I think we've had pretty detailed conversation on the single audit. I do have one other issue that I'd like to bring up, unless Mr. Nobles or anybody else has a comment on what I just said.
Senator Benson did have her hand up, and so I want to see if Senator Benson is on the single audit.
I am, to the single audit point.
Senator Cran, if we could move to Senator Benson then, and then we'll come back to you.
I'm good. Yep, I'll raise my hand again.
Okay.
Senator Benson.
And I understand the single audit should be performed where the money is. One of my concerns about moving the single audit is, does it give you enough eyes in the places you need to be, Mr. Nobles, to give us some idea? And I know the single audit really limits what you look at, but to be able to see, as you said, other issues that might be occurring. So that's one concern about making the move, because if you give it to MMB, essentially a fox guarding the hen house, it feels like a little bit. And Chair Liebling and I are on a lot of the LAC and the LCRC reviews, and MMB does a lot of interpretation that sometimes our nonpartisan fiscal staff might raise questions about. And so I'm concerned about them interpreting federal guidance on, in particular, CARES money, and then also auditing. And so I understand that you are not properly resourced for the single audit, but I also understand there is some value in having your eyes, your auditor's eyes in more places. And so I think if we can move this forward in legislative language instead of just an agreement, it will bring to light some of these concerns, I think, appropriately before a finance committee in particular, to say, M&B, if you've been getting this money, why hasn't it been moving to the appropriate place? And so I'm not a no on moving the single audit. You very thoughtfully presented why, but I think some questions as to the other benefits that might come from you being involved with the single audit. And with that, I'll lower my hand and just listen to the ongoing comments.
If I could just briefly respond, I would certainly assure you that if we did not do the single audit, we would still have eyes in the places of concern to you and other legislators. It would, in fact, free us up to not only have our eyes on those issues in those agencies, but to address very specifically the kinds of issues that are of concern to you rather than the concerns of CMS or what other agency might be there. So, but it's a very important point, you know, Senator Benson. I think our presence is important, just being there and, you know, interacting with agency people, having our staff. Unfortunately, with COVID, we're not there in the way we used to be. And I hope someday we can get our staff back, because believe me, we get a lot of information in hallway conversations from agency staff on things that they would like auditors to look at. So a point well taken.
Thank you. I have a question on the single audit.
Me too.
Is the single audit defined in statute? Is there any authority? I'm looking at kind of the legislative boilerplate in terms of definitions, assignments, references, or is it essentially non-existent in terms of statute? That's the first question.
Mr. Chairman, it is non-existent in state law. It exists in federal law, and but it was never incorporated into state law as a responsibility for OLA or anybody else. So state law is silent.
So in addition, we would probably need some basic boilerplate statutory definitions and explanations as well regarding this, and I think that's important. Secondly, is
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Kiffmeyer.
after you're done, I just wanted to.
And then secondly, I would think, is there any contract? Do you as a legislative auditor have to sign a contract annually, or was there a governor's executive order back in the 70s that assigned the responsibility? Is there any historical framework on responsibilities or roles for the legislative auditor regarding the single audit?
Mr. Chairman, again, I'm not aware of any. I think it was when the federal law was passed in 1996, by the way. Well, originally, that was an amended law. The original Single Audit Act was actually in 1984, and then it was amended in 1996. Again, there was no framework put around who in Minnesota state government was going to have that responsibility. There was no executive order that I'm aware of. There was just a kind of an agreement that the Office of the Legislative Auditor would do it.
And finally, in other states, is the task assigned in any state to perhaps the state auditor or an equivalent? I think some states have a comptroller, or they may call it a treasurer. Other states call it, but is it assigned to a statewide elected official anywhere in any of the other states?
Mr. Chairman, actually, one of the things I think we should do in preparation for discussion of this issue in the legislative session is get more details. But I have discussed this issue with a number of my colleagues around the country, and there's a variety of ways in which it's done. Some legislative auditors actually handle the contract. They contract out that part of their single audit work, or some of them contract out the entire single audit work. So in other cases, again, it's left to the executive branch to hire a firm to do it. And the firm has to be independent, has to be qualified. I mean, the federal government pays close attention to who's doing these audits. And in fact, as a result, there's another piece that comes into play, and that is the federal government expects the audit organization that does this work to have what is referred to as a peer review. And so every few years, any organization that does a single audit and does other work under generally accepted accounting or auditing standards has to have a peer review. So those firms that would be qualified have to have a peer review, and they have to be deemed by the federal government as independent to do the work. But, you know, again, in some states, the state auditor or legislative auditor signs that contract. In other places, they leave it to the executive branch to do that.
Senator Kiffmeyer, were you on the single audit?
Yep.
Okay, Senator
So
Kiffmeyer.
is mine, Mr. Chairman.
So I would go back to Senator Rest then,
Thank
and then
I would say, so Mr. Nobles, one of my questions for you is, if the resources were appropriated to you, would you be able to then take on the role of doing the single audit if the additional funds, if maybe you had the ability to collect through the indirect support statute, that you would be able to, by proportion of their responsibility of the audit. So instead of MMD doing that from the different agencies, instead you would. I do like the idea of Senator Benson bringing up, you know, having some oversight coming from the legislative auditor, like you have mentioned in some other states where you actually do the contract. But there's two issues here. One is the oversight and doing some of those things, and the other one is getting it paid for. What's bringing this to a crux is that the legislative auditor's office and the legislative branch has just been absorbing more and more and more of these costs. And now it has gotten to the point where it's squeezing out other functions the legislative audit is supposed to do. And that's what's bringing it to the head. So I want to be sure we retain maybe, or do some of those things that are really good policy as far as oversight. But the germane, most challenging issue right now is the legislative auditor, how that actual thing gets done.
Mr. Chairman, just a brief response. If we had the money and you wanted us to continue to do the single audit, we could do that and then do some of the other work as well. But I would say, and I can probably read the minds of the audit directors who are listening to this, one of the reasons they and I know Chris Boozy felt strongly that he wanted to shift this is we want to do work that you care about. We want to do work that gets your attention. We want to do work that you want to hold a hearing on. And frankly, some of, as Ms. Lyson was mentioning, we just have, our experience is that you haven't held a hearing on the fact that Deed drew down some money in violation of a federal law and therefore had to pay, what was it, $22 in interest back to the federal government. That is just not top of the mind of legislative committees. And so, yes, we could do it. We certainly have the skills, probably do it cheaper than an outside firm. But a lot of it is, again, we do it and then we send the report off to some agency, you know, in the federal government. And we just did a bunch of work that isn't that relevant to you. So that, well, let's keep that into consideration as well.
Senator Rest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to comment on what Mr. Noble said and Senator Kiffmeyer and Senator Benson. It is a function of the legislature to monitor the executive branch. The issue is whether it's whether it's appropriate for the legislature to monitor the federal government. And any executive branch agency, it seems to me, in state government is fair game, obviously, and our responsibility. It's that gray area of where does the legislature come into play in monitoring or auditing the federal government. I agree that with Senator Benson that even though no legislation exists now, that if we were to propose that the single audit be done either through the executive branch, through MMB, or I might even prefer a contract to an outside independent firm to do all the data gathering and analysis and whatever, and that perhaps both MMB and the OLA share a level of oversight of the work that's being done by an outside firm. I also have a related question with regard to federal funds. Are there any other audits other than the ones other than the single audit that involves federal pass-through funds that the OLA audits or monitors, and what is the distinction?
Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, I
No,
had
fine.
someone at the door. I have to go for a minute, but I'm sure that I'll
So you want me to
be back
pause?
in a second to get
Okay. All right,
Well,
I'll wait till you're back.
Well, she's getting her package there. Just someone had asked what the bill number was. Senator Cran, maybe if you just want a bill number.
Mr. Chairman, it is Senate File 3929.
Was there a House file?
I did not find one, Mr. Chairman, and no, there was no companion.
And for those watching at home, that is during the regular session.
Yes.
Searching for it, not
Yes.
not for one of the others.
Yes.
Maybe Senator Cran, if you could ask your question too, so we get it on deck here.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things that that COVID delayed, Senator Rest and I were brought or made aware of that the Walz administration, in conjunction with the Office of MMB, that they issued a notice to all agencies that was going to require all financial data that was requested by the OLA or the office, the Legislative Budget Office, would be verified and kind of scrubbed through MMB prior to distribution to the OLA and to the office or the Legislative Budget Office. So my question is to Mr. Nobles. I think we spoke about it. He had spoken about it to the Commissioner Franz at the time. Do you or are you aware, has that proposed process or data flow been implemented? If no, great. If yes, do we believe that will continue with the new commissioner?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cran, I do not know. What I try to do is just make sure that nothing inhibits our work and our ability to get information from state agencies in a timely way. And I would remind you that in addition to requesting data, we often just go directly into the state's accounting system and other data systems. We don't rely on the agency. So there's no opportunity for it to go somewhere else to be, as you suggested, scrubbed. I cannot, of course, don't have the authority to tell the governor or the commissioner of MMB how to exercise their authority over the executive agencies. So I will leave that to them as long as it does not impinge upon the independence and the work of the legislative auditor. And
Mr. Chair.
Senator Cran.
Thanks, Mr. Nobles. And so we will review that process and that proposal since we have new administration or new leader of the MMB as well. And I think at the time, Senator Russ and I were looking at nonpartisan staff to look at the roles and rights of the legality of even making such requests that it would impede your ability to do your job as well as the Legislative Budget Office. And so we will start that process back up now that we have to get everybody up and functioning again to make sure that doesn't happen. We can't have that type of process in front of the LA and or the Legislative Budget Office. That is the responsibility, or your responsibility is to be our eyes and ears and our watchdog for the legislative body, and we need to make sure that's preserved. So, and I think we would have great bipartisan support on that. So I just wanted your thoughts and opinions. Thanks, Mr. Nobles.
thank you. And I can answer now Senator Rest's question. And I think I understood it to be, can we go, have we ever audited a program that was federally funded? Do we have that authority, or absent the single audit work, is our federally funded programs out of bounds? The answer is we can audit any program that involves public money and federal money, dedicated money, general fund money. And so, yes, and we have audited, we have done investigations of programs that were 100% federally funded. And many of the programs are certainly funded with a lot of federal money and some state match. But the fact that a program is funded with federal money does not in any way inhibit our ability to audit that program.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I just have one quick question about the financial audits, and then I'll be done. And thank you for indulging me. I'm concerned about the financial audits often reveal internal control violations or challenges, and I'm concerned about not doing them, then keeps that information from us. And I, for one, think that that is an extremely valuable function. You asked, what do we want to hear? Well, I want to know that the internal controls that are revealed when a financial audit is done, that we know about them, and that agencies reasonably are put on notice, and that they expect to be questioned when they have compliance issues, and in particular when they have lax internal controls. So please, as you're making these judgment calls, know that that is a function, at least some of us, we want to know. Yep. Where internal controls not only are not being adequately exercised, but in particular, as you know, when findings are repeat findings, where they get told they've done something that is not really according to good accounting standards, and they keep on doing the same thing. So that's just a comment more, but I do regard those as very important. Thank you.
And
Mr. Nobles.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rest, and we do too. We want to do more of what we call control compliance audits of agencies. And I think that, so we're right on board with what you're saying.
Members, I think this has been a good discussion. I think it's a type of discussion we need to have. And I think we're going to see a number of agencies having to have these discussions, not only because of COVID, but because reform is going to be upon us with the challenges that we're facing. I would like to ask if before our next meeting, maybe the staff could come up, Mr. Nobles, with I like what you've done with the OLA budget options to show us kind of that maybe a little bit of research. I don't, in terms of what is being done in other states or some of the other options to give us a framework, maybe not for action on October 8th, but to continue to hone the options out. And then members, if over the next couple months we work on getting language that would be good, or at least some options that could be presented to the next legislature. If that would be okay, Mr. Nobles?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. We will do that. And one other item I would like to bring forth, we've sort of touched on it, for the Legislative Audit Commission to consider, and I hope we can reach agreement on a bill. We often call them a housekeeping bill. And so there are a number of items that accumulate over the years where something happens and we look at our statute and we don't find the language that we would like. So I have a list that I would like to bring forth, but I'll leave that for another day.
And that's good. I think we should do that.
All right.
Before we move to the more discussion on the budget, I want to just hop ahead to item 3 and ask, because we are going to need to adjourn at 2:30 on the performance evaluation. Members, you have that in front of you. What I would maybe recommend is that we have an executive committee meeting prior to the October 8th meeting to follow the 30-day requirement of initiating the performance reviews, so we can set at least the timeline so it's clear at the next meeting that we follow the procedure and begin that at the October 8th meeting. That would also give Mr. Nobles time to be working on filling the position for the second the financial auditor deputy, which I think we all agree is very important. So members, is that kind of okay if we can move forward with that at the next meeting of kind of developing the timeline, and then we can spend the next 10 minutes a little more on the budget? Mr. Nobles.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I would actually like to call on Judy Randall again. She was of great assistance in putting together the document that you have in front of you on options. And so if she could just walk through that with you, and I can certainly join in, but Judy, if you could walk through the budget options document.
Ms. Randall.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You have a table in front of you, and perhaps we can do screen share and put it up on the screen as well so the public can see it. We were asked to put together a number of options for the upcoming budget. There's a range of options, as you can see, ranging from a fairly significant reduction in our budget to kind of expanding, which in this budget climate obviously is unlikely, but we wanted to kind of walk through those options. I think the first thing to know as you look at this table is that the base number we're using is our fiscal year 21 appropriations. That's basically the base number we're using. And I will note that's around, it's just under $8.3 million a year. And that number does include the money that's dedicated for certain purposes. So it includes about $700,000 for money. It includes $700,000 for audits focused on MCOs and for DHS eligibility. So the first two options you see are reductions, and we all know the budget climate we're in, and it's our understanding that the executive branch agencies were asked to put together kind of 5% and 10% reduction budgets. And so that's what you see here in options 1 and 2. As when Mr. Nobles ran through the expenditures at the beginning of the meeting, you may have noted that over 90% of our expenditures are personnel. We're a people business here. And so with reductions would come position eliminations. So if we did have a 10% reduction, that would result in about 9 to 10 positions eliminated. It would be around an $830,000 reduction annually. The 5% reduction, would result in 4 to 5 positions eliminated. The option 3 is the status quo option. And so that's assuming the same amount of funding that we received for fiscal year 21. And this is a place where kind of some of the flexibility that we've just been talking about related to maybe the single audit, maybe also expanding the use of the money for the DHS MCO audits and DHS eligibility audits, perhaps to expand to looking at anything related to DHS. So some additional avenues of flexibility, either through single audit or through those dedicated purpose funds, would help us weather a status quo appropriation. We also think that would give us the flexibility to allow us to provide maybe more of those special reviews or more of those internal control compliance audits that we think are more valuable to the legislature and more of what you're interested in. Options 4 and 5 are unlikely. We realize that in this budget climate, but it's something that we were asked to put together. And also, these are areas, special reviews and our IT audits, where the legislative demand for our work in these areas really outstrips our ability to provide them. And so we thought it would just be instructive and an interesting conversation point to show you kind of what it would take for us to do more special reviews or to provide more oversight of the state's IT audit or IT systems. As I think we've talked about before with the commission, we have had an increasing number of requests for special reviews, as we've discussed in this meeting. In fact, some of those have come in law and we are mandated to do them. We have one person right now conducting our special reviews. That's Mr. Alter, who you heard from earlier, the Director of Special Reviews. So option 4 simply says, this is what it would take. We use an average salary amount. This is what it would take to create a team for special reviews. 3 people, still not a lot, but certainly more than one person. There has been some discussion among some members, I know, of formalizing the role of special reviews within our office. So right now we have the Program Evaluation Division and the Financial Audit Division. I think there may be some interest if we do increase the number of staff devoted to special reviews to formalize that structure a little bit more within the office. Finally, option 5 is adding 2 IT auditors to our staff. I think as we touched on briefly, I think there's an expectation or a hope perhaps that OLA is providing oversight and accountability of the state's IT systems. Well, we have 2 IT auditors, and frankly, some of their time is spent conducting financial audits. So to expect that 2 IT OLA auditors, however wonderful they may be, can provide adequate oversight of the state's IT systems, I think we just don't want to mislead you on what we're actually able to do. So option 5 is a modest, 2 more people, so a team of 4 IT auditors, would provide at least a little bit more oversight of the state's IT systems. So again, it's not something that we're advocating for or pushing for or asking. It's really some pieces of information about the impact of reductions on OLA, and then what it may take to better meet some of the demand we're seeing for some of the oversight and accountability we can provide. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Randall, do you know if there's been any cost savings as a result of COVID, for example, travel expenses, any carryover from between the fiscal years, or any other type of things that as we're doing this virtually, if it's resulted in any savings?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We don't have a large travel budget to begin with, so I would say we're not finding a lot of savings there. I think primarily our savings are coming right now, unfortunately, through some open positions that we just haven't filled, that we would like to fill, the financial audit deputy being one. We do have a total of 6 positions open right now. So that is really where our savings have come from. We do have staff working remotely, but of course we still have our office space, and we have had to do some things to help keep staff working productively. So for example, one thing we did is we got staff mobile phones because they're talking to stakeholders, they're talking to agency folks, and they were using their personal home phones to do that, which wasn't really appropriate in many cases. And so while maybe there's slightly less travel. There's other costs that we've had to accrue.
Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is not so much for Ms. Randall, but for the group at large. Have there been applications for these positions that are open? And because they're not filled yet, what has that cost savings been?
Mr. Nobles or Ms. Randall?
Well, I will say yes. I mean, we have on some of these positions been actively seeking candidates. For example, Ms. Bombach, who is with us, she lost a very key staff member for doing some of the work that she does, both on MCOs and at DHS. And we have not been able to fill that position. We have sought candidates, but none really had the qualifications that we required. Other positions that are vacant, we really have not been actively seeking people, just given the circumstance that we're in. We have thought it more prudent to just wait and see how things develop in terms of the financial situation of the state.
Mr. Chair,
Ms. Randall?
if I could just add, we are actively seeking and planning to fill the deputy role, of course, which will cost us some money. And then there's also the confidential assistant to the deputy, which I believe we plan to fill once the deputy is filled.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Erickson.
Thank you.
Ms. Randall, did you have to get permission for hiring? Is there a hiring freeze that you had to seek permission for hiring to move forward?
Mr. Chair and members, yes, under the current guidelines by the LCC, there is a hiring freeze, and we would need to seek permission for any positions we're filling at this point.
Representative Erickson, do you have a follow-up question?
No, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Members, any other members have questions? I think it was good to get the budget information in front of us. Obviously, this is going to be a journey over the next few weeks and months. I think this gives members a chance to think about it, and we can continue this discussion October 8th. Senator Cran, do you have any comments before we wrap it up here?
Nope, I'm good, Mr. Chair.
Well, it being 2:30, which is the time that we had allotted, members, I think if we can study through this, and Mr. Nobles, Ms. Randall, you're able to answer any questions if people want to follow up. I think this is a good discussion and the beginning of this process. So,
is the next meeting on October 8th also at 1 p.m.?
Mr. Chair, Senator, it's at 10 a.m., I believe.
10 a.m. Okay, thank you. Just wanted to be sure.
10 a.m. October 8th.
Yes.
Well, thank you all. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thanks.